Welcome back, everybody, to the Worldwide Dissent Show. My name is Bryony, and I'm joined by my co-host,
Jay Kendrick.
Today, we want to talk to you guys about Iran briefly. So there was this new article that came out in the Sydney Morning Herald titled, "Canberra Open to Joining International Effort Against Iran." And that is especially important in our Australian context because it directly involves our military presence in the Middle East. Jake?
Yeah, so let's briefly discuss a few important points that this article talked about. So basically, the first paragraph is the Morrison government has basically left the door open, in quotes, to joining a coordinated international effort to ratchet up pressure on Iran. And Morrison has also previously stated that renewed sanctions against Iran remain on the table if they continue to, quote, destabilize the region, unquote. So I just want to briefly discuss this destabilize the region sort of thesis. I guess Morrison's point is that a country that destabilizes the Middle East makes, that country is ripe for the imposition of sanctions against them. Let's analyze some events that have happened in the Middle East or continue to happen in the Middle East that may be considered destabilizing events. First of all, let's begin with our prime ally, the United States of America, which, for anyone who has even a brief knowledge of the Middle East history, understands that they have been destabilizing the region for decades. We can go all the way back to the 1953 overthrow of the democratically elected government in Iran, the country that we're actually on the precipice of war with at the moment. So they overthrew the democratically elected government in 1953, surely a destabilizing act. We can continue on to a more contemporary example as well. So the US and the UK invasion of Iraq in 2003, which resulted in hundreds of thousands of corpses. It was an illegal act of aggression, a region devastated. It created a power vacuum out of which ISIS and other jihadi groups flourished, and they have since been rampaging through the region, causing immense amounts of trouble. So that was surely a destabilizing act. And we're not even mentioning the criminal and disgusting sanctions that were placed on the Iraqi people, not the Iraqi regime, because they didn't suffer from these sanctions. The Iraqi people who suffered under the boot of Western sanctions in probably the decade prior to the actual Iraq war itself. So these surely constitute destabilizing events, Bronny. Would you agree?
I would definitely agree. And so surely, following his own thesis, Morrison would apply sanctions to America, to Australia.
That's right.
To the UK, to Israel, to these states that are destabilizing the region. But,
that is where the thesis naturally leads, isn't it? Australia actually helped in the Iraq war. Of course, it was an illegal act of aggression. This is worse than state sponsor of terrorism. That was outright aggression, for which we would invoke the Nuremberg principles. And this is terrible, absolutely terrible. So these events surely constitute...
The pretenses of the Iraq war were weapons of mass destruction, which did not exist.
They found thousands of them, didn't they? I'm sorry, no.
Oh, you mean the ones the ones the Americans sold to Iraq? 2 decades ago? Okay, yeah. And John Bolton was the primary architect of that war, who is the same MOFO who is trying to start war with Iran today.
Yeah, this guy has been parading his bullshit around the American political sphere for, over a decade now. Like you said, one of the principal architects of the Iraq war. This guy has never met a war he wouldn't love. He loves war. He's been absolutely clear in his desire to overthrow the Iranian regime.
And he looks like a walrus. Trump said it himself. Look it up for yourself.
Absolutely. Yeah, he's disgusting.
Anyway, to move on to another point in that same article, US Secretary of State is now going around the world and asking, how can we build a global coalition to push back against the world's largest state sponsor of terror? And now Mike Pompeo is referring to Iran in this statement. And I think it's a very interesting statement and needs further examination because it's a big claim to say that Iran is the world's largest sponsor of state terror. And so just last night I did a bit of research and lo and behold, my favorite warmonger, Hillary Clinton.
Ooh,
how much I love Hillary Clinton. So she was caught saying that in a candid moment that donors in Saudi Arabia constitute the most significant source of funding to Sunni terrorist groups worldwide. Similarly, in a leaked memo by WikiLeaks, Clinton says that more needs to be done since Saudi Arabia remains a critical financial support base for Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, LET, and other terrorist groups. So it's really illuminating to see what Hillary Clinton and elites, kind of political neoconservative or just warmongers are willing to say in the privacy of their own home, in the privacy of their own echo chambers. Yet when they step on stage with their public face, they completely obfuscate the issue and they point to Iran as the largest destabilizer, which is obvious bullshit, because in private they point to the opposite. And I think we can move past that and actually observe facts as to who actually contributes to the largest sources of terror in the world. And in fact, it is Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia, since the late 70s, has been pushing their version of their interpretation of Islam, which is the Wahhabi and Salafist interpretation. And this is the most ultra-conservative interpretation of Sunni Islam and is the ideological basis for Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and the Taliban. And since the late 70s, some 1,500 mosques and 2,000 schools have been set up, built, and funded by the Saudi regime to perpetuate this ideology. And I don't know, does that to you constitute as possibly, fitting in the category of the world's largest state sponsor of terror?
I think that definitely would. I think it would also constitute a destabilizing event. So surely via the Morrison thesis, we would also have to sanction them. Moving on, briefly want to talk about Yemen as well, because that is a complete disaster that is almost entirely, it's completely supported by the West. For those of you who don't know, very brief, there is a Saudi-led coalition at the moment who are currently ruthlessly bombing Yemen and imposing a brutal blockade, preventing humanitarian aid from getting in. The UN Secretary General has called it the world's worst humanitarian crisis. 22 million people are in dire need of humanitarian aid. There's 18 million or so lack reliable access to food, so it's a crisis of untold proportions. And it's directly aided and abetted by the US and the UK, who are not only selling huge amounts of weapons to the Saudi regime as they butcher women and children in Yemen, but also actually providing them with material and logistical support. So intelligence, refueling their planes mid-air.
As they conduct bombing.
As they conduct bombing runs. These are flat-out war crimes.
Sorry, just to interrupt. I remember reading in papers not too long ago, and this is a contemporary issue, that the Saudi military discriminately bombs hospitals, markets, weddings, schools, potato chip factories, and I'm not making that up. I mean,
that's a legitimate fact.
This is ridiculous. And of course, that I don't think that constitutes as a destabilizing act.
Oh, I think it.
But Morrison hasn't said it, so I don't know.
Well, we'd have. I guess we have to take Morrison's word for it.
I think we do. Yeah. Anyway.
The thesis that a country that is perpetuating destabilizing acts in the Middle East deserves sanctions. I don't think that thesis in and of itself is inherently bad, but it leads to conclusions that, well, hang on a second, which other countries have perpetuated much worse destabilizing acts in the Middle East in the last decade or 2 decades? And do those countries also deserve to have the international community place crippling sanctions on them to destroy their economies, which would also, of course, hurt the people, which are the prime, not the prime target, but they always end up being the people who suffer under
the recipient of these.
Exactly, they are the ones that suffer under these sanctions, because of course they have human consequences that are almost never discussed.
That's right.
So the thesis breaks down, basically, unless Morrison is prepared to come out at a press conference tomorrow and sanction the United States, the UK, and Australia. I'm not sure how he would manage to sanction his own country. Possibly. Yeah. Regardless, the tensions in Iran should be recognized for what they are. They are US aggression. Absolutely US aggression. They began with the removal of when the Trump administration removed themselves from the JCPOA, a functioning deal that Iran was abiding by. And, we should oppose war fervently.
That's right. If the US media did its job, if the media in general did its job, then you wouldn't be getting polls like this, which recently came out, said that 36% of Americans would back a war with Iran. And that is
incredible.
disgraceful. And that is the US media failing to do its job, pushing the narrative that the military wants it to push because it benefits the military-industrial complex, it benefits banks that have loans to these countries, that wars create damage needs loans, and just in general it's a racket, as I cooked his name, doesn't matter. Anyway, yes, I think people need to wake up because the world cannot afford, Australians, Americans, we cannot afford to enter into another war.
Absolutely.
And Iran is no Iraq. Iran can fight back. Iran will bleed the American economy if a war does break out. And
it will be a terrible development for everyone involved. So we should, of course, oppose it on moral grounds. But if we just want to consider tactics as well, no, it's not a good tactic. It will be economically unviable. It will hurt people all over the world, including in the US and Iran as well. So we should fervently oppose these developments.
Thanks for listening, guys.
Thank you.